Chapter 3. At a quarter before midnight, clad in a heavy ulster and with slippered feet, I crept cautiously from my room and stole down the passage to the top of the stairs. Outside the doctor's door I waited a moment to listen. All was still, the house in utter darkness, no gleam of light beneath any door. Down the length of the corridor, from the direction of the sick room, came faint sounds of laughter and incoherent talk that were not things to reassure a mind already half a-tremble, and I made haste to reach the hall and let myself out through the front door into the night. The air was keen and frosty, perfumed with night smells, and exquisitely fresh. All the million candles of the sky were alight, and a faint breeze rose and fell with far-away sighings in the tops of the pine trees. My blood leaped for a moment in the spaciousness of the night, for the splendid stars brought courage. But the next instant, as I turned the corner of the house, moving stealthily down the gravel drive, my spirits sank again ominously. For yonder, over the funereal plumes of the 12-acre plantation, I saw the broken yellow disk of the half-moon just rising in the east, staring down like some vast being come to watch upon the progress of our doom. Seen through the distorting vapors of the earth's atmosphere, her face looked weirdly unfamiliar, her usual expression of benignant vacancy somehow a twist. I slipped along the shadows of the wall, keeping my eyes upon the ground. The laundry house, as already described, stood detached from the other offices, with laurel shrubberies crowding thickly behind it, and the kitchen garden so close on the other side that the strong smells of soil and growing things came across almost heavily. The shadows of the haunted plantation, hugely lengthened by the rising moon behind them, reached to the very walls and covered the stone tiles of the roof with a dark pall. So keenly were my senses alert at this moment that I believe I could fill a chapter with the endless small details of the impression I received, shadows, odor, shapes, sounds, in the space of the few seconds I stood and waited before the closed wooden door. Then I became aware of someone moving towards me through the moonlight, and the figure of John Silence, without overcoat and bareheaded, came quickly and without noise to join me. His eyes, I saw at once, were wonderfully bright, and so marked was the shining pallor of his face that I could hardly tell when he passed from the moonlight into the shade. He passed without a word, beckoning me to follow, and then pushed the door open and went in. The chill air of the place met us like that of an underground vault, and the brick floor and whitewashed walls, streaked with damp and smoke, threw back the cold in our faces. Directly opposite gaped the black throat of the huge open fireplace, the ashes of wood fires still piled and scattered about the hearth, and on either side of the projecting chimney column were the deep recesses holding the big twin cauldrons for boiling clothes. Upon the lids of these cauldrons stood the two little oil lamps, shaded red, which gave all the light there was, and immediately in front of the fireplace there was a small circular table with 3 chairs set about it. Overhead, the narrow slit windows, high up in the walls, pointed to a dim network of wooden rafters half lost among the shadows, and then came the dark vault of the roof. Cheerless and unalluring, for all the red light, it certainly was, reminding me of some unused conventicle, bare of pews or pulpit, ugly and severe, and I was forcibly struck by the contrast between the normal uses to which the place was ordinarily put, and the strange and medieval purpose which had brought us under its roof tonight. Possibly an involuntary shudder ran over me, for my companion turned with a confident look to reassure me, and he was so completely master of himself that I at once absorbed from his abundance and felt the chinks of my failing courage beginning to close up. To meet his eye in the presence of danger was like finding a mental railing that guided and supported thought along the giddy edges of alarm. I am quite ready, I whispered, turning to listen for approaching footsteps. He nodded, still keeping his eyes on mine. Our whispers sounded hollow as they echoed overhead among the rafters. I'm glad you are here, he said. Not all would have the courage. Keep your thoughts controlled and imagine the protective shell round you, round your inner being. I'm all right, I repeated, cursing my chattering teeth. He took my hand and shook it, and the contact seemed to shake into me something of his supreme competence. The eyes and hands of a strong man can touch the soul. I think he guessed my thought, for a passing smile flashed about the corners of his mouth. You will feel more comfortable, he said in a low tone, when the chain is complete. The colonel we can count on, of course. Remember, though, he added warningly, he may perhaps become controlled, possessed, when the thing comes, because he won't know how to resist, and to explain the business to such a man. He shrugged his shoulders expressively. But it will only be temporary, and I will see that no harm comes to him. He glanced round at the arrangements with approval. Red light, he said, indicating the shaded lamps, has the lowest rate of vibration. Materializations are dissipated by strong light, won't form or hold together in rapid vibrations. I was not sure that I approved altogether of this dim light, for in complete darkness there is something protective, the knowledge that one cannot be seen, probably, which a half-light destroys. But I remembered the warning to keep my thoughts steady, and forbore to give them expression. There was a step outside, and the figure of Colonel Raggy stood in the doorway. Though entering on tiptoe, he made considerable noise and clatter, for his free movements were impeded by the burden he carried, and we saw a large yellowish bowl held out at arm's length from his body, the mouth covered with a white cloth. His face, I noted, was rigidly composed. He, too, was master of himself, and as I thought of this old soldier moving through the long series of alarms, worn with watching and wearied with assault, unenlightened yet undismayed, even down to the dreadful shock of his sister's terror, and still showing the dogged pluck that persists in the face of defeat, I understood what Dr. Silence meant when he described him as a man to be counted on. I think there was nothing beyond this rigidity of his stern features, and a certain greyness of the complexion, to betray the turmoil of the emotions that were doubtless going on within. And the quality of these two men, each in his own way, so keyed me up that by the time the door was shut and we had exchanged silent greetings, all the latent courage I possessed was well to the fore, and I felt as sure of myself as I knew I ever could feel. Colonel Raggy set the bowl carefully in the center of the table. "Midnight," he said shortly, glancing at his watch, and we all three moved to our chairs. There, in the middle of that cold and silent place, we sat, with the vile bowl before us, and a thin, hardly perceptible steam rising through the damp air from the surface of the white cloth, and disappearing upwards the moment it passed beyond the zone of red light and entered the deep shadows thrown forward by the projecting wall of chimney. The doctor had indicated our respective places, and I found myself seated with my back to the door and opposite the black hearth. The colonel was on my left, and Dr. Silence on my right, both half facing me, the latter more in shadow than the former. Thus we divided the little table into even sections, and sitting back in our chairs, we awaited events in silence. For in something like an hour I do not think there was even the faintest sound within those four walls and under the canopy of that vaulted roof. Our slippers made no scratching on the gritty floor, and our breathing was suppressed almost to nothing. Even the rustle of our clothes, as we shifted from time to time upon our seats, was inaudible. Silence smothered us absolutely, the silence of night, of listening, the silence of a haunted expectancy. The very gurgling of the lamps was too soft to be heard, and if light itself had a sound, I do not think we should have noticed the silvery tread of the moonlight as it entered the high narrow windows and threw upon the floor the slender traces of its pallid footsteps. Colonel Raggy and the doctor, and myself too for that matter, sat thus like figures of stone, without speech and without gesture. My eyes passed in ceaseless journeys from the bowl to their faces, and from their faces to the bowl. They might have been masks, however, for all the signs of life they gave, and the light steaming from the horrid contents beneath the white cloth had long ceased to be visible. Then, presently, as the moon rose higher, the wind rose with it. It sighed, like the lightest of passing wings, over the roof. It crept most softly round the walls. It made the brick floor like ice beneath our feet. With it I saw mentally the desolate moorland flowing like a sea about the old house, the treeless expanse of lonely hills, the nearer copses, sombre and mysterious in the night. The plantation, too, in particular, I saw, and imagined I heard the mournful whisperings that must now be a-stirring among its tree-tops as the breeze played down between the twisted stems. In the depth of the room behind us, the shafts of moonlight met and crossed in a growing network. It was after an hour of this wearing and unbroken attention, and I should judge about 1 o'clock in the morning, when the baying of the dogs in the stable-yard first began, and I saw John Silence move suddenly in his chair and sit up in an attitude of attention. Every force in my being instantly leaped into the keenest vigilance. Colonel Raggy moved too, though slowly, and without raising his eyes from the table before him. The doctor stretched his arm out and took the white cloth from the bowl. It was perhaps imagination that persuaded me the red glare of the lamps grew fainter, and the air over the table before us thickened. I had been expecting something for so long that the movement of my companions and the lifting of the cloth may easily have caused the momentary delusion that something hovered in the air before my face, touching the skin of my cheeks with a silken run. But it was certainly not a delusion that the colonel looked up at the same moment and glanced over his shoulder as though his eyes followed the movements of something to and fro about the room, and that he then buttoned his overcoat more tightly about him, and his eyes sought my own face first, and then the doctor's, and it was no delusion that his face seemed somehow to have turned dark, become spread, as it were, with a shadowy blackness. I saw his lips tighten, and his expression grow hard and stern, and it came to me then with a rush that, of course, this man had told us but a part of the experiences he had been through in the house, and that there was much more he had never been able to bring himself to reveal at all. I felt sure of it. The way he turned and stared about him betrayed a familiarity with other things than those he had described to us. But it was not merely a sight of fire he looked for, it was a sight of something alive, intelligent, something able to evade his searching. It was a person. It was the watch for the ancient being who sought to obsess him. And the way in which Dr. Silence answered his look, though it was only by a glance of subtlest sympathy, confirmed my impression. "We may be ready now," I heard him say in a whisper, and I understood that his words were intended as a steadying warning, and braced myself mentally to the utmost of my power. Yet long before Colonel Raggy had turned to stare about the room, and long before the doctor had confirmed my impression that things were at last beginning to stir, I had become aware in most singular fashion that the place held more than our 3 selves. With the rising of the wind, this increase to our numbers had first taken place. The baying of the hounds almost seemed to have signaled it. I cannot say how it may be possible to realize that an empty place has suddenly become not empty, when the new arrival is nothing that appeals to any one of the senses, for this recognition of an invisible, as of the change in the balance of personal forces in a human group, is indefinable and beyond proof. Yet it is unmistakable. and I knew perfectly well at what given moment the atmosphere within these four walls became charged with the presence of other living beings besides ourselves, and, on reflection, I am convinced that both my companions knew it too. "Watch the light," said the doctor under his breath, and then I knew too that it was no fancy of my own that had turned the air darker, and the way he turned to examine the face of our host sent an electric thrill of wonder and expectancy shivering along every nerve in my body. Yet it was no kind of terror that I experienced, but rather a sort of mental dizziness, and a sensation as of being suspended in some remote and dreadful altitude where things might happen, indeed were about to happen, that had never happened before within the ken of man. Horror may have formed an ingredient, but it was not chiefly horror, and in no sense ghostly horror. Uncommon thoughts kept beating on my brain like tiny hammers, soft yet persistent, seeking admission. Their unbidden tide began to wash along the far fringes of my mind, the currents of unwanted sensations to rise over the remote frontiers of my consciousness. I was aware of thoughts, and the fantasy of thoughts, that I never knew before existed. Portions of my being stirred that had never stirred before, and things ancient and inexplicable rose to the surface and beckoned me to follow. I felt as though I were about to fly off at some immense tangent into an outer space hitherto unknown even in dreams, and so singular was the result produced upon me that I was uncommonly glad to anchor my mind, as well as my eyes, upon the masterful personality of the doctor at my side, for there, I realized, I could draw always upon the forces of sanity and safety. With a vigorous effort of will, I returned to the scene before me, and tried to focus my attention, with steadier thoughts, upon the table and upon the silent figures seated round it. And then I saw that certain changes had come about in the place where we sat. The patches of moonlight on the floor, I noted, had become curiously shaded. The faces of my companions opposite were not so clearly visible as before, and the forehead and cheeks of Colonel Wragge were glistening with perspiration. I realized further that an extraordinary change had come about in the temperature of the atmosphere. The increased warmth had a painful effect, not alone on Colonel Wragge, but upon all of us. It was oppressive and unnatural. We gasped figuratively as well as actually. "You are the first to feel it," said Dr. Silence in low tones, looking across at him. "You are in more intimate touch, of course." The colonel was trembling, and appeared to be in considerable distress. His knees shook, so that the shuffling of his slippered feet became audible. He inclined his head to show that he had heard, but made no other reply. I think even then he was sore put to it to keep himself in hand. I knew what he was struggling against. As Dr. Silence had warned me, he was about to be obsessed, and was savagely, though vainly, resisting. But meanwhile, a curious and whirling sense of exhilaration began to come over me. The increasing heat was delightful, bringing a sensation of intense activity, of thoughts pouring through the mind at high speed, of vivid pictures in the brain, of fierce desires and lightning energies alive in every part of the body. I was conscious of no physical distress, such as the colonel felt, but only of a vague feeling that it might all grow suddenly too intense, that I might be consumed, that my personality, as well as my body, might become resolved into the flame of pure spirit. I began to live at a speed too intense to last. It was as if 1,000 ecstasies besieged me. "Steady!" whispered the voice of John Silence in my ear, and I looked up with a start to see that the colonel had risen from his chair. The doctor rose too. I followed suit, and for the first time saw down into the bowl. To my amazement and horror, I saw the contents were troubled. The blood was astir with movement. The rest of the experiment was witnessed by us standing. It came, too, with a curious suddenness. There was no more dreaming, for me at any rate. I shall never forget the figure of Colonel Raggy standing there beside me, upright and unshaken, squarely planted on his feet, looking about him, puzzled beyond belief, yet full of a fighting anger. Framed by the white walls, the red glow of the lamps upon his streaming cheeks, his eyes glowing against the deathly pallor of his skin, breathing hard and making convulsive efforts of hands and body to keep himself under control, his whole being roused to the point of savage fighting, yet with nothing visible to get at anywhere. He stood there, immovable against odds. And the strange contrast of the pale skin and the burning face I had never seen before, or wish to see again. But what has left an even sharper impression on my memory was the blackness that then began crawling over his face, obliterating the features, concealing their human outline, and hiding him inch by inch from view. This was my first realization that the process of materialization was at work. His visage became shrouded. I moved from one side to the other to keep him in view, and it was only then I understood that, properly speaking, the blackness was not upon the countenance of Colonel Raggy, but that something had inserted itself between me and him, thus screening his face with the effect of a dark veil. Something that apparently rose through the floor was passing slowly into the air above the table and above the bowl. The blood in the bowl, moreover, was considerably less than before. And with this change in the air before us, there came at the same time a further change, I thought, in the face of the soldier. One half was turned towards the red lamps, while the other caught the pale illumination of the moonlight falling aslant from the high windows, so that it was difficult to estimate this change with accuracy of detail. But it seemed to me that while the features, eyes, nose, mouth, remained the same, the life informing them had undergone some profound transformation. The signature of a new power had crept into the face and left its traces there, an expression dark and, in some unexplained way, terrible. Then suddenly he opened his mouth and spoke, and the sound of this changed voice, deep and musical though it was, made me cold and set my heart beating with uncomfortable rapidity. The being, as he had dreaded, was already in control of his brain, using his mouth. "I see a blackness like the blackness of Egypt before my face," said the tones of this unknown voice that seemed half his own and half another's. "And out of this darkness they come. I gave a dreadful start. The doctor turned to look at me for an instant, and then turned to center his attention upon the figure of our host, and I understood in some intuitive fashion that he was there to watch over the strangest contest man ever saw, to watch over and, if necessary, to protect. "He is being controlled, possessed," he whispered to me through the shadows. His face wore a wonderful expression, half triumph, half admiration. Even as Colonel Raggy spoke, it seemed to me that this visible darkness began to increase, pouring up thickly out of the ground by the hearth, rising up in sheets and veils, shrouding our eyes and faces. It stole up from below, an awful blackness that seemed to drink in all the radiations of light in the building, leaving nothing but the ghost of a radiance in their place. Then, out of this rising sea of shadows, issued a pale and spectral light that gradually spread itself about us, and from the heart of this light I saw the shapes of fire crowd and gather. And these were not human shapes, or the shapes of anything I recognized as alive in the world, but outlines of fire that traced globes, triangles, crosses, and the luminous bodies of various geometrical figures. They grew bright, faded, and then grew bright again with an effect almost of pulsation. They passed swiftly to and fro through the air, rising and falling, and particularly in the immediate neighborhood of the colonel, often gathering about his head and shoulders, and even appearing to settle upon him like giant insects of flame. They were accompanied, moreover, by a faint sound of hissing, the same sound we had heard that afternoon in the plantation. the fire elementals that precede their master. The doctor said in an undertone, "Be ready." And while this weird display of the shapes of fire alternately flashed and faded, and the hissing echoed faintly among the dim rafters overhead, we heard the awful voice issue at intervals from the lips of the afflicted soldier. It was a voice of power, splendid in some way I cannot describe, and with a certain sense of majesty in its cadences, and as I listened to it with quickly beating heart, I could fancy it was some ancient voice of time itself, echoing down immense corridors of stone, from the depths of vast temples, from the very heart of mountain tombs. "I have seen my divine father Osiris," thundered the great tones. "I have scattered the gloom of the night. I have burst through the earth, and am one with the starry deities." Something grand came into the soldier's face. He was staring fixedly before him, as though seeing nothing. "Watch," whispered Dr. Silence in my ear, and his whisper seemed to come from very far away. Again the mouth opened, and the awesome voice issued forth. "Thoth," it boomed, "has loosened the bandages of Set, which fettered my mouth. I have taken my place in the great winds of heaven." I heard the little wind of night and its mournful voice of ages sighing round the walls and over the roof. "Listen," came from the doctor at my side, and the thunder of the voice continued. "I have hidden myself with you, O ye stars that never diminish. I remember my name in the house of fire." The voice ceased, and the sound died away. Something about the face and figure of Colonel Wragge relaxed, I thought. The terrible look passed from his face. The being that obsessed him was gone. "The great ritual," said Dr. Silence aside to me, very low. "The Book of the Dead. Now it's leaving him. Soon the blood will fashion it a body." Colonel Wragge, who had stood absolutely motionless all this time, suddenly swayed, so that I thought he was going to fall, and but for the quick support of the doctor's arm, he probably would have fallen, for he staggered as in the beginning of collapse. "I am drunk with the wine of Osiris," he cried, and it was half with his own voice this time, "but Horus, the eternal watcher, is about my path, for safety." The voice dwindled and failed, dying away into something almost like a cry of distress. "Now watch closely," said Dr. Silence, speaking loud, "for after the cry will come the fire." I began to tremble involuntarily. An awful change had come without warning into the air. My legs grew weak as paper beneath my weight, and I had to support myself by leaning on the table. Colonel Wragge, I saw, was also leaning forward with a kind of droop. The shapes of fire had vanished all, but his face was lit by the red lamps, and the pale, shifting moonlight rose behind him like mist. We were both gazing at the bowl, now almost empty. The colonel stooped so low I feared every minute he would lose his balance and drop into it, and the shadow that had so long been in process of forming now at length began to assume material outline in the air before us. Then John Silence moved forward quickly. He took his place between us and the shadow. Erect, formidable, absolute master of the situation, I saw him stand there, his face calm and almost smiling, and fire in his eyes. His protective influence was astounding and incalculable. Even the abhorrent dread I felt at the sight of the creature growing into life and substance before us lessened in some way, so that I was able to keep my eyes fixed on the air above the bowl without too vivid a terror. But as it took shape, rising out of nothing as it were, and growing momentarily more defined in outline, a period of utter and wonderful silence settled down upon the building and all it contained. A hush of ages, like the sudden center of peace at the heart of the traveling cyclone, descended through the night, and out of this hush as out of the emanations of the steaming blood issued the form of the ancient being who had first sent the elemental of fire upon its mission. It grew and darkened and solidified before our eyes. It rose from just beyond the table, so that the lower portions remained invisible, but I saw the outline line itself upon the air, as though slowly revealed by the rising of a curtain. It apparently had not then quite concentrated to the normal proportions, but was spread out on all sides into space, huge though rapidly condensing, for I saw the colossal shoulders, the neck, the lower portion of the dark jaws, the terrible mouth, and then the teeth and lips, and as the veil seemed to lift further upon the tremendous face, I saw the nose and cheekbones. In another moment I should have looked straight into the eyes. But what Dr. Silence did at that moment was so unexpected, and took me so by surprise, that I have never yet properly understood its nature, and he has never yet seen fit to explain in detail to me. He uttered some sound that had a note of command in it, and in so doing stepped forward and intervened between me and the face. The figure just nearing completeness he therefore hid from my sight, and I have always thought purposely hid from my sight. "The fire!" he cried out. "The fire! Beware!" There was a sudden roar as of flame from the very mouth of the pit, and for the space of a single second all grew light as day. A blinding flash passed across my face, and there was heat for an instant that seemed to shrivel skin and flesh and bone. Then came steps, and I heard Colonel Wragge utter a great cry, wilder than any human cry I have ever known. The heat sucked all the breath out of my lungs with a rush, and the blaze of light, as it vanished, swept my vision with it into enveloping darkness. When I recovered the use of my senses a few moments later, I saw that Colonel Wragge, with the face of death, its whiteness strangely stained, had moved closer to me. Dr. Silence stood beside him, an expression of triumph and success in his eyes. The next minute the soldier tried to clutch me with his hand. Then he reeled, staggered back, and, unable to save himself, fell with a great crash upon the brick floor. After the sheet of flame, a wind raged round the building, as though it would lift the roof off, but then passed as suddenly as it came. And in the intense calm that followed, I saw that the form had vanished, and the doctor was stooping over Colonel Wragge upon the floor, trying to lift him to a sitting position. "Light," he said quietly, "more light. Take the shades off." Colonel Wragge sat up, and the glare of the unshaded lamps fell upon his face. It was grey and drawn, still running heat, and there was a look in the eyes and about the corners of the mouth that seemed in this short space of time to have added years to its age. At the same time, the expression of effort and anxiety had left it. It showed relief. "Gone," he said, looking up at the doctor in a dazed fashion, and struggling to his feet. "Thank God! It's gone at last!" He stared round the laundry as though to find out where he was. "Did it control me? Take possession of me? Did I talk nonsense?" he asked bluntly. "After the heat came, I remember nothing." "You'll feel yourself again in a few minutes," the doctor said. To my infinite horror, I saw that he was surreptitiously wiping sundry dark stains from the face. "Our experiment has been a success, and—" He gave me a swift glance to hide the bowl standing between me and our host, while I hurriedly stuffed it down under the lid of the nearest cauldron. "And none of us the worse for it," he finished. "And fires?" he asked, still dazed. "There'll be no more fires?" "It is dissipated, partly at any rate," replied Dr. Silence cautiously. "And the man behind the gun," he went on, only half realizing what he was saying, I think. "Have you discovered that?" "A form materialized," said the doctor briefly. "I know for certain now what the directing intelligence was behind it all." Colonel Wragge pulled himself together and got upon his feet. The words conveyed no clear meaning to him yet, but his memory was returning gradually, and he was trying to piece together the fragments into a connected whole. He shivered a little, for the place had grown suddenly chilly. The air was empty again, lifeless. "You feel all right again now," Dr. Silence said, in a tone of a man stating a fact rather than asking a question. "Thanks to you, both, yes." He drew a deep breath and mopped his face and even attempted a smile. He made me think of a man coming from the battlefield with the stains of fighting still upon him, but scornful of his wounds. Then he turned gravely towards the doctor with a question in his eyes. Memory had returned, and he was himself again. "Precisely what I expected," the doctor said calmly. "A fire elemental sent upon its mission in the days of Thebes, centuries before Christ, and tonight, for the first time, all these thousands of years, released from the spell that originally bound it." We stared at him in amazement, Colonel Raggy opening his lips for words that refused to shape themselves. "And if we dig," he continued significantly, pointing to the floor where the blackness had poured up, "we shall find some underground connection, a tunnel most likely, leading to the 12-acre wood. It was made by your predecessor." "A tunnel made by my brother?" gasped the soldier. "Then my sister should know. She lived here with him." He stopped suddenly. John Silence inclined his head slowly. "I think so," he said quietly. "Your brother, no doubt, was as much tormented as you have been." He continued after a pause in which Colonel Raggy seemed deeply preoccupied with his thoughts, "and tried to find peace by burying it in the wood, and surrounding the wood then, like a large magic circle, with the enchantments of the old formulae, so the stars the man saw blazing." "But burying what?" asked the soldier faintly, stepping backwards towards the support of the wall. Dr. Silence regarded us both intently for a moment before he replied. I think he weighed in his mind whether to tell us now or when the investigation was absolutely complete. "The mummy," he said softly after a moment. "The mummy that your brother took from its resting place of centuries and brought home. Here." Colonel Raggy dropped down upon the nearest chair, hanging breathlessly on every word. He was far too amazed for speech. "The mummy of some important person, a priest most likely, protected from disturbance and desecration by the ceremonial magic of the time, for they understood how to attach to the mummy, to lock up with it in the tomb, an elemental force that would direct itself even after ages upon anyone who dared to molest it. In this case it was an elemental of fire." Dr. Silence crossed the floor and turned out the lamps one by one. He had nothing more to say for the moment. Following his example, I folded the table together and took up the chairs, and our host, still dazed and silent, mechanically obeyed him and moved to the door. We removed all traces of the experiment, taking the empty bowl back to the house, concealed beneath an ulster. The air was cool and fragrant as we walked to the house, the stars beginning to fade overhead, and a fresh wind of early morning blowing up out of the east, where the sky was already hinting of the coming day. It was after 5 o'clock. Stealthily, we entered the front hall and locked the door, and as we went on tiptoe upstairs to our rooms, the colonel, peering at us over his candle as he nodded good night, whispered that if we were ready, the digging should be begun that very day. Then I saw him steal along to his sister's room and disappear.